everyone, welcome to this week's bonus episode. I am your host, Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones, about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine. And guess what, everyone? There's going to be, you know this already because I've been talking about it on the show, but there's going to be a Mr. Jones graphic novel coming out from Oni Press, which is under Simon & Schuster. It is a book I've been working on for 1 million years as a backup plan in case I could not get my film made, that at least I would have a graphic novel and the story, the script would get out into the world that way. And ironically, the graphic novel took a lot longer and was to an extent even harder than the film itself. And the film was shot during a historic snowfall in Ukraine where our teeth were freezing and cell phones stopped working. It was so cold. And yet this graphic novel, a labor of love for so many years, was just so much harder. I don't know why. It was just harder. I love making graphic novels. I love working with illustrators. I don't know why. Maybe, when the book launches, we're all at the book party this fall, get me a couple of ciders and I'll figure it out with you, okay? But until then, the book's coming out, the baby's being born. It's a beautiful book. I'm so incredibly proud of it. It was worth the wait. It'll be available to you September 4th, but you can pre-order it now. And we are working on some sort of events to do around it to raise awareness of what's going on in Ukraine, obviously tied to the election where Ukraine is on the ballot, where our very democracy is on the ballot. I'm very proud of this book. It's called In the Shadow of Stalin. It is the adaptation of the screenplay for Mr. Jones, including some of the deleted scenes that we couldn't include in the final cut of the film because otherwise the film would have been 3 hours long. So if you want to see essentially the shooting script of Mr. Jones, the film, get your hands on a copy of the graphic novel In the Shadow of Stalin with gorgeous art by a Brazilian artist named Ivan Rodriguez. I'm very honored and thrilled to bring you that. So now we are going to, in this bonus episode, feature the expertise of dear friend and longtime friend of the show, Terrell Starr of the Essential Black Diplomats podcast and Substack. Terrell is currently in Ukraine, where I miss him already very much. So Terrell breaks down why the average American voter should care about what is happening in the country of Georgia. There are massive protests in Georgia right now spreading across the country in response to the Russian-backed politicians in Georgia's parliament hastily trying to force through a law that is modeled on an anti-democracy law in Russia, which essentially criminalizes civil society, criminalizes free speech. It goes after any organization, media group, arts group, small press, you name it, civil society by and large, that accepts any donations from abroad up to 20%. And that can be a lot of them. And it criminalized a lot of rights that Georgians currently enjoy and are flexing mightily to try to block the final passage of this law. The law is known as the Russian law. And the gaslighting term for it, being driven by the Russian-backed politicians, is the foreign agents law, which is bullshit, right? What people have to understand, and which Terrell Starr will speak to beautifully, is that this is the type of law that we should expect soon from the so-called red states among us as they continue their march towards authoritarianism. You think the abortion bans are bad now? Well, think about all the blue states that are helping people in these so-called red states get the reproductive health care that they need. It's just a matter of time before these so-called red states start going after the work that we're doing in these so-called blue states to try to protect those whose rights, whose very existence, LGBTQ plus people, are under assault. They're practically doing it now by criminalizing doctors and anybody that will help any person cross state lines to get an abortion anywhere else. Mike Pence said that he wants every state in the union to operate by the laws of Mississippi. That's not how our democracy was designed to work. The founding fathers had a lot of disagreements, but they agreed on checks and balances. And that is what this far-right Christian nationalism is trying to undo now. And they've long waited for their strongman. They found their strongman in Trump, and they want Trump to finish off the job, destroy what's left of our tattered, barely breathing democracy at this point. So that is why we all need to pay close attention to what is happening in the country of Georgia and how average citizens are responding to it, putting their lives on the line, their freedom on the line. And no matter how brutal the riot police are in response and trying to violently suppress these protests, more and more Georgians are flooding the street. And that is the lesson we need to take from this. This is what happened in Euromaidan to overthrow Yanukovych, the Donald Trump of Ukraine, brought to power with the help of the Kremlin and longtime Republican operative Paul Manafort. And Ukrainians just overwhelmed them and ran Yanukovych out of town. And now the same needs to happen for these Russian-backed politicians in Georgia. So there's a lot to cover there. The law has been voted on by parliament, but it will be vetoed by Georgia's president, but then go back to the parliament, which will vote for it again. And they're trying to really shove this through while the West is distracted by Netanyahu's genocide against Gaza and MAGA causing all that chaos for months and deliberately holding up Ukraine aid, which has weakened Ukraine's resistance efforts. So Russia's really striking now by trying to get this law passed in Georgia and to complete Russian state capture of Georgia. It's a crisis moment. The State Department is on the ground there. Obviously, they just had a big announcement saying that Georgian politicians will have travel bans and sanctions placed against them if the violence continues against protesters and so on. There's a big parliamentary election in Georgia at the end of October, right as Americans are heading to the polls. So there's two big elections this fall, at least two, that Russia absolutely must win to regain its empire. And that is, of course, here at home, our own election on November 5th, 2024, and the parliamentary elections in Georgia at the end of October 26th, I believe. So that's going to be a huge election to watch because all of these protesters that are growing across the country, they can then build a political movement to wash out the Russian scum from their own parliament and liberate their country. Remember, what's happening in Georgia is Russian state capture. What has happened in the U.S., growing over the years through Donald Trump and his MAGA movement, is an attempt of Russian state capture against our own democracy here at home. And if America falls, so many other countries, of course Ukraine, but so many other countries their democracies will be at risk as well. The far-right virus will spread exponentially should the U.S. fall. Before we get to the discussion with Terrell about why what's happening on the ground in Georgia matters to the average American voter, I am going to answer some questions from our listeners at the Democracy Defender level or higher on Patreon. The first question is from Jim. Has anyone measured how media coverage for Russian atrocities in Ukraine dropped after the continued intense focus on Palestine? Yes, that has been measured. There's a great piece from CNN, which I will link to in the show notes. And the bottom line is all the stats have showed the coverage of Ukraine plummeted when the Netanyahu-Hamas war broke out. And keep in mind, Russia is allied in both sides of that conflict. Russia is closely allied with Netanyahu. There's a sizable Russian population in Israel. All of the leading Russian oligarchs, many of them have Israeli passports because of their deep ties, connections to Israel, and so on it goes. And then Hamas, for years, has been allied with Russia. Hamas leaders have made several trips to Moscow in the last 2 years alone, leading up to the October 7th attack, and so on it goes. So Russia really is benefiting from the Netanyahu-Hamas war. Just to show you some numbers, I'm going to read now from that CNN article. Closed captioning data from the Internet Television Archive, which was analyzed by the GDELT project, showed that on cable news, coverage of the Ukraine war plummeted dramatically after Hamas's shocking October 7th terror attack. In the days before the Israel-Hamas war, the battle in Ukraine amounted to about 8% of CNN's television coverage. After the attacks, CNN, the cable news network that provided the most Ukraine coverage, fell to under 1%. And on it goes. And data provided by ComScore, the internet analytics firm, showed a similar trend online. Obviously, October 7th was a huge shock, and the atrocities, the collective punishment unleashed by Netanyahu's coalition terrorists in response to October 7th was devastating to watch and still watch play out. And all of that deserved a lot of coverage to try to stop that collective punishment, because there is no military solution. As U.S. intelligence, as the State Department, as the Biden administration keep telling Netanyahu, your game of whack-a-mole with Hamas and its leadership is not working. It's not working. And so the only solution is a political one. Netanyahu's not only carrying out a genocide, he's deliberately prolonging this conflict to avoid a two-state solution, because that would be the political solution, a viable, sustainable two-state solution brokered by the U.S. and its allies, ensuring that all the grassroots working towards peace are funded, are supported, and are given leadership roles in sort of a ruling coalition to help this two-state solution be seated and really take effect. But in order for that to happen, there needs to be regime change on both sides of Hamas, freeing the Palestinians themselves, because Hamas is Animal Farm. Hamas is a vicious, cruel dictatorship that came to power through an election and then destroyed any chance for future elections. And the Palestinian people were hostage of Hamas, as well as Israel's apartheid system. So all of that deserved coverage and exposure that was long overdue. If you'll remember from an early episode in October on Palestine and Israel, I sampled a lot from a excellent series on the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accords that came out in September 2023. And they were saying this crisis is being overlooked. The growing conflict is being overlooked. It's a powder keg. The U.S. needs to do more. And so a lot of what we're doing now is sort of making up for a lot of lost time when a record number of Palestinians were killed by Israeli forces increasingly. So while we need more Ukraine coverage, because Ukraine has been made increasingly vulnerable deliberately by MAGA, by what Mike Johnson deliberately did in blocking aid for 6 critical months in the House, Palestinians need our support as well. And the Israelis on the ground who want a two-state solution, who stand for peace, need to be amplified as well. So we can't pit these genocides against each other. We can't pit these conflicts against each other. There needs to be room for all of our shared liberation to basically carry all of these issues in top of mind, because what happens over there impacts us here at home. As we know, we're all connected. We know that. We've been living that for a long time now. We've been confronted with that truth. For instance, like Donald Trump did not come to power in 2016 overnight. There was a whole vacuum of Western power that allowed a resurgence of Kremlin aggression to basically bring Trump to power right in front of our faces. Many of us who are longtime Ukraine watchers saw this happening, and what a horror we were living, screaming at the top of our lungs. And there was a small group of us. The CIA should have known better. The FBI should have known better. We were getting our information from the public domain. So they even had better intelligence than we had. And the fact that was allowed to happen, there's no excuse. So everybody, what happens over in Ukraine matters to us here at home. What happens in Georgia matters to us here at home. What happens to Palestinians and democracy in Israel matters to us here at home. We are up against a coalition of strong men who want to live above the law, who want to dodge accountability and enrich themselves and spread their corruption as a weapon in order to stay in power and die in power. That's what they all want. Trump, Putin, Netanyahu, the corrupt leadership of Hamas, Sinwar, they all want that same thing. And that's why we have to stay vigilant on all these conflicts, and we can do it. We're strong enough and brave enough to do it. It is a moral obligation not to look away. Thank you. In these last several difficult, grim months, I want to just thank everybody. As coverage of Ukraine did plummet, I want to thank all those people out there that refused to look away, that amplified the voices out of Ukraine, contacted their members of Congress demanding urgent aid. Thank you so much to you. Your work, your efforts have saved lives. I want to end this answer by highlighting reporting from Sean Walker of The Guardian, who shared some disturbing details that made me think of my grandfather, who inspired my film, Mr. Jones. My grandfather, who was arrested as a young father during Stalin's purges in the 1930s. And this is what Sean Walker wrote. And as you read this, I'm telling you, this is what my grandfather experienced and that he wrote about in his own memoir, this type of torture. Sean Walker writes, and I'll link to this in the show notes, "The following prison details stick in my mind from this interview I did with a Ukrainian prisoner of war who is now returned on life in Russian prison. 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., no sitting or lying permitted, only standing up. The speaker system played radio programs about Ukrainian Nazis on loop. Twice a day, routine of standing legs apart while being beaten with truncheons and electric shockers. Forced to read poetry, begging forgiveness from fraternal Russians while being beaten. That's what Stalin did. That is what Stalin did. And Putin is doing it now. This is why we cannot leave anybody behind when it comes to Ukraine. This is why all of Ukraine must be free. What I just read to you is happening in Russian-occupied Crimea and Russian-occupied Donbass. This war is not over until everyone is liberated, no one left behind. Otherwise, that's what you're condemning them to, a Stalinist hellhole. And we cannot allow that to happen, and we cannot allow that to spread. Ukraine's liberation is all of our liberation. And thank you again to everyone who refused to look away during this time of collapsing press coverage of an urgent genocide in Ukraine. Thank you. Floundericious WA writes, Andrea, thank you. Great run of guests and episodes the last couple of months. Wow. Thank you, Floundericious. Question, when looking for polling info in an election year, what kind of sources do you trust? Polling, as we know, is very anxiety-inducing, so I try to stay away from it, and I try to just keep my head down and focus on what I do have control over, which is organizing all the great phone banks we're going to do together to get out the vote in this make it or break it election, because there's so much on the ballot, and the 2024 election in the US is bigger than Biden, okay? There's just so much on the state level we need to fight for in the Senate and the House, and we're going to win, and win we must. But when it comes to polling, what I do see headlines I cannot avoid about Biden's abysmal polls, I like to always breathe into a paper bag by checking the Twitter account of Tom Bonnier, who's a CEO of the Terra Group, and he's a senior advisor to the political data firm Target Smart. He was formerly of Howard University. And I always found him to be a voice of reason. He was right that the 2022 midterm elections were going to defy historical trends and that women and young people were going to lead the way. He gets a lot of flack in the media sometimes for being like a hopium guy, but his numbers have been holding up. His data holds up. I think the force of gravity in the media is just to be cynical about everything. And Tom sort of cuts through that noise by saying, hey, we should really pay attention to how pissed off women of all ages are that their reproductive rights, reproductive health care was just stripped from them after so many women and people gave their lives for those rights. And more rights, like the right to vote, could be on the chopping block next because we're up against a Christian nationalist death cult. So Tom Bonnier, I would love to have him on the show. I think he's excellent. Question 2 from Floundericious WA. What exactly is the holdup on aid to Ukraine? Weren't we told that the Department of Defense had supplies positioned to surge quickly? Did they? The amount of aid Ukraine needs after the massive onslaught of Russian missiles that it's had to endure during its many months, 6 months of lack of aid from the US, the largest supplier of Ukraine aid for the battlefield. It's a lot of equipment to move. Obviously, not enough is getting through at times. And there's a lot of anger on the ground in Ukraine itself. So one British journalist based in Kyiv who's done brilliant coverage of the war was blasting Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who is in Kyiv now this week, who was playing music on his guitar in a bar in Kyiv. And I know the message that Blinken was trying to send through soft diplomacy, playing Rockin' in a Free World on his guitar and singing, and Blinken being a huge rock and roll nerd. People were kind of blasting him saying like, enough of that. Where's the missile defense systems? Where's the Patriot systems? Please keep in mind, the United States under Biden is giving Ukraine just enough to stay in the fight. We're not giving Ukraine what it needs to actually liberate its territory, to actually finish off Russia and push them out. There's still a lot of hand-wringing from the Biden administration. They haven't made up their mind. As Tim Snyder said on the show back when he was last on in December 2022, the United States still has not made up its mind whether it wants Ukraine to win or not. They say we're going to be with Ukraine until the very end. Well, you can hasten things up. You can finish this off by deciding that you want it to end. And the way you decide that is by giving Ukraine not just American hand-me-downs, but really state-of-the-art stuff that can close Ukraine's skies, that can keep its civilians alive, that can help business flourish across the country, that could open up Ukraine's skies again to planes and so on. We're just giving Ukraine enough to stay in the fight. Long story short, MAGA, Mike Johnson, and the rest of his MAGA death cult, their deliberate delay of Ukraine aid for 6 critical months has been so disastrous for that country and their struggle to protect their civilians and to stop Russia's barrage of missiles. Russia right now is raining missiles on Kharkiv, one of Ukraine's largest cities, which is an innovative hotbed. It's one of Ukraine's Silicon Valleys, a lot of universities in Kharkiv. It's a very young city. It's just unthinkable to see what is happening to it now as Russia is threatening to level it to the ground and make it unlivable and move in Russians to steal all that land and to rebuild their homes there on stolen land. We should not have gotten to this point. MAGA Mike Johnson and the death cult ensured that I got to this point. And now the U.S. is scrambling to play catch up and giving the bare minimum that the Biden administration feels comfortable with because they're too afraid of Putin's nuclear war saber rattling when Ukrainians themselves are not. And Ukrainians themselves are saying, please give us more aid, give us Patriot missiles, close our skies. If you will not send NATO jets or allied jets to close our skies, then give us all that we need to close our own skies. That the U.S. can do. Sending more Patriot missiles, the U.S. can do. Scholz of Germany, the leader of Germany, he could stop bowing down to the Russian lobby in Germany and that sort of German reactive tendency to try to be anti-American, as Scholz especially is, was sort of like, oh, we're not on the leash of American imperialism. We're independent thinkers. We make decisions for Germany. Right. Well, you're making decisions for the Russian lobby by delaying all of the state-of-the-art missile defense systems that you could be giving Ukraine right now that you're holding back on, the Tauruses, because you're wringing your hands over because of the Russian lobby in Germany and so on. So yeah, there's a lot more that Ukraine's allies could be doing for Ukraine to not just keep Ukrainians alive and save more lives, but to kick Russia out completely and liberate all of those Soviet prisons that Russians have put up in Donbass and Crimea. All right. Linda writes, what are the premises you, meaning anyone, including me, base your political and other decisions on? Me, I believe people should have equal opportunities to use their abilities. However, if a right-winger tells me that God says men are inherently superior to women and women should be subservient and should not work because that is the place God gave them in the world, I cannot refute that. Oops, because it is a belief. My belief is that all people should be allowed to use their abilities. The view of the right is that only white men and a few honorary white men should be allowed to succeed. Defining where we start our premises is important. So is our goal. I agree with you, Linda, that people should be able to live their lives without government intervention on forcing them to have births and to have certain sort of jobs, choose to work, not to work. And yeah, Christian nationalism's assault on our very right to the pursuit of happiness, to the pursuit of greater democracy and fairness for all. These so-called libertarians that have taken over the Republican Party, like the Koch political network, a group of far-right libertarian Republicans, they back these Christian nationalists who want to control how we live and think and brainwash us and carry out this whole like trad wife phenomenon of women being forced to like just be slaves in the home. Just the irony that libertarians who claim that they want less government, they want small government, they want to be able to drown government in the bathtub, they have unleashed the most oppressive, controlling, intrusive, no privacy government that the U.S. has ever been threatened with. They use Christian nationalism, controlling sick-in-the-head Christian nationalism as a weapon against us. These libertarians did, these oligarch libertarians, because they wanted to protect their oil profits. They wanted to protect the very existence of big oil against environmental reforms. And they wanted to roll back regulations. And the irony is they brought in these Christian nationalist terrorists to do it. And they're basically against everything libertarians claim they stand for. So I'm with you. I'm all about our shared liberation, empathy, and science-driven leadership, and just allowing people to live in peace and harmony. And as part of that, rooting out corruption and any sort of fascist threats. My sort of goal for the United States is to try to get us on a path of being more like the Scandinavian countries, like strong safety net programs, strong foreign policy, low corruption rates, high happiness rates. Those are the models that I'm after. So thank you for that question. And next up is Leah. What other things do you think are going on when there are big distractions like Trump's court trials? Well, there's a very long list, Leah, but I will tell you, I have turned off cable news because I'm so tired of the Trump trials. It reminds me a lot of how obsessed cable news was with the Mueller report. And it just seems like they're going to be setting people up for disappointment. I talked to a friend who's covering the trials. She said that it's a ratings bonanza because people want to finally see some accountability for Trump and his coalition of criminals. The reality is that none of us should be dependent on the outcome of any of these court cases. I certainly am not. What it comes down to, once again, is us. It's the grassroots. It is us working harder than we've ever had to work before, just to eke through one more time, hoping that this is his last time running for president. Obviously, next time around in 2028, if we're so lucky to have an election in 2028, if Trump doesn't get in this year, we're going to have to do it again, but probably for somebody like Nikki Haley, maybe even an Ivanka. But we have to keep holding on for dear life until we have the next census in 2030, which is our chance to push against gerrymandering and our chance to dismantle gerrymandering and to push for greater representation in a lot of these states and hopefully get some seats back in states like New York and California for representation in Congress to try to even out the playing field a bit more. That's really, really key. If you want to help fight for democracy, hold on for dear life these next election cycles and join me in volunteering in 2030 for the census to increase representation where we need it most. All right. Brock writes, "Hey, Andrea, recently Mitt Romney was caught saying the quiet part out loud. Congress was motivated to force TikTok to sell because they didn't like how they couldn't control the media narrative. Do you think this statement is true? What are your thoughts on the whole TikTok issue?" I think Romney absolutely gave it away. I think they're going after TikTok because it's an easy target given its affiliation with China. Trying to look strong on China is a bipartisan issue. And I think ultimately they have a harder time probably reeling in TikTok, whereas they have an easier time reeling in Facebook because Facebook donates heavily to both Democrats and Republicans. And a lot of those Democratic centrists are mobbed up with Silicon Valley. Nancy Pelosi and Ivanka Trump on the same night accepted some Silicon Valley award, which was very clearly given by the industry to thank them for lobbying on for their own interests. This was during the Trump regime. And so I think TikTok is harder to control because the algorithms there have been deliberately pumping what China wants you to see and really promoting, for instance, the atrocities in Gaza, which I think is fine generally because people should be aware of what's going on there. And China very firmly is against Israel in this conflict. But China could be manipulating a lot more than just that. And so I think it's very clear here that TikTok is more of a loose cannon, whereas the more traditional Silicon Valley companies, even Elon Musk, I know he's unleashing all the Nazis. He's bringing back Nick Fuentes, restoring that Nazi's Twitter account. I think largely he's not being reined in because, again, he's attached to all that Silicon Valley money that has been so normalized in Washington. If you look at Peter Thiel, for instance, who is part of that PayPal mafia, that anti-woke agenda of Elon Musk and David Sachs that are pushing all these Kremlin talking points. Peter Thiel, who funds authoritarian pro-Kremlin candidates like J.D. Vance, who won his Senate race in Ohio and has become a staunch Kremlin mouthpiece in the Senate, lobbying against aid for Ukraine. Peter Thiel, he has made a fortune off of Palantir, which maps human beings. And the DOJ and other government agencies have become dependent on Palantir. Law enforcement uses Palantir to try to disrupt and identify money laundering networks and all sorts of mafia networks and criminal networks. But it could also be used to map out activists of all kinds that are disrupting the status quo, including oil corporate profits, and so on it goes. So if you're wondering why a lot of these pro-Palestinian protesters on these campuses are wearing face coverings, it's in part to protect their identity from a lot of this new dictator tech software that is advancing, where they can be easily identified and tracked. And therefore, it's for their own safety and security. And you might think, well, shouldn't they be proud? Shouldn't they hold their face up to stand by their convictions and their beliefs? Not if it's going to make them a target for some sort of authoritarian government or authoritarian-leaning government. I mean, look at what Kushner did to Jamal Khashoggi and passing on intelligence that allowed MBS to have him butchered at the Saudi embassy in Turkey. So I'm all for protesters, activists covering their faces for their own protection, given how advanced technology has become and how manipulative. So with Congress, both parties going up against TikTok and trying to make TikTok the story, that's just the height of hypocrisy, because TikTok is just one of many tech giants trying to manipulate us for some greater agenda. Let's say you're hardcore pro-Palestinian and you're totally fine with TikTok pumping in all these algorithms to really emphasize stories about Gaza. You might not be fine on the stories that TikTok is suppressing. I don't see them talking about the Uyghur genocide like that China is carrying out. So that's why it's not about like, well, I agree with this tech overlord on this issue, so I'm fine with it. No, it's just the manipulation itself is the problem. And Congress's hypocrisy is the problem. Mark Zuckerberg's still a free man, given how he broke the law in allowing the Russians to harvest our data in 2016 and how he lied about it. I'll link to more of that in the show notes of this week's episode. All right, everyone. So those are the questions for this week. If you are a Democracy Defender level or higher supporter at the Gaslit Nation Patreon community, get your questions in. I always love hearing from you. You shape our show. It's comforting to know that we're all thinking about the same things and what's keeping us all up at night. Keep in mind that we're going to get through this year. It's important for all of us to stay creative, to work on things that make us happy, to make things that make us happy, to work with our higher mind, because the fascists want to immobilize us. They want to freeze us with fear. Do not let that happen. Live your best life right now. Enjoy life. Just know you have a community here that is working together to protect our democracy here at home and therefore abroad for everyone. And just make your plan this year off of the Gaslit Nation Survival Guide on our homepage at gaslitnationpod.com. Donate to whatever groups you can. Join me at the phone banks I'm currently working on getting set for all of us to fight like hell in this, yet again, another make it or break it election. We are going to pull through. I do believe that we have each other. We can overcome this. We will. We have no choice. We'll do it together. Now, to hear the full episode of this week's bonus show, make sure you're subscribed at the Truth Teller level or higher on Patreon at patreon.com/gaslit. That's patreon.com/gaslit. Thank you to everyone who supports the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.